Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be discussing the African poem, The Grieved Lands of Africa by Augostinho Neto. And we are going to be looking at the background of the poem, the background of the poet, as well as the detailed analysis of the entire poem, stanza by stanza. Please subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell so that you get notified when the video on the major themes in the poem is uploaded. We are going to start with the background of the poet Augostinho Neto. Augostinho Neto was born in 1922 and he died in 1979. He was the president of Angola from 1975 to 1979. He is one of the foremost voice against colonialism during colonial period in Africa, especially in Angola. Augostinho Neto was imprisoned several times by the colonialists, by the Portuguese colonialists who colonized Angola because of his voice against colonialism, because of his support and advocacy for self-rule and self-government, because of his fight for independence. The colonialists saw him as a threat and he was imprisoned several times in London, in Portugal, and in several places where he was taken to. So, towards the end of colonialism in Angola, he was part of the people who contested for the post of a presidency, and he won overwhelmingly, and he governed the people for a very period of time, for 6 years, from 1975 to 1979. And the background of the poem, The Grieved Land of Africa, is a poem that chronicles the experiences of Africans during the colonial period. You can see from the background of the poem, it has to do with a lot of black people, how transatlantic trade caused the Africans, especially the blacks, to be taken to European countries to go do a kind of slavery. Then the poem also deals with colonialism and also the hope and fight for independence of African countries from the colonial shackles. Now you could see this picture portray the colonialism that Africans experienced during the transatlantic trade and the kind of slavery that Africans experienced. And the poem also discuss the old ancient slavery and the modern slavery. So let's look at it in detail from the stanzas of the poem. In stanza 1, the poem captures the historical background of the sufferings of Africa. In line 1, it says, the grieved lands of Africa, in the tearful woes of ancient and modern slave, in the degrading sweat of impure dance. So you could see that the land is grieved in the first line. In the second line, the poem talks about the experiences of Africa. They were enslaved during the colonial period and they are even still slaves. And the current slavery is called modern slave or modern slavery. And also the degrading sweat was the coming of the Europeans, and the reasons that the Europeans gives for coming to Africa was to come and modernize Africa, and the poem regarded it as impure dance, and as a result of that impure dance, the land is grieved. Okay, so in stanza 2 of the poem, okay, look at it. This is modern slavery, where the colonialists or the Europeans come to Africa, they mine gold, they mine diamond, they mine other precious mineral resources, and they employ Africans as slaves. So the Africans, both men and women, are the one digging the ground, doing the mining, but the real resources from the land are taken away by the colonialists. And even though the African countries are independent now, the colonialists are still coming to exploit us in a way of maybe having the kind of agreement with us, bonds, giving of bond, giving of money, borrowing, and some several other ways. So in stanza 2 of the poem, the poem captures the experiences of Africa in detail, and it says the grieved lands of Africa in the infamous sensation of the stunning perfume of the flower crushed in the forest by the wickedness of iron and fire, the land, the grieved lands. So you could see from the stanza 2 that the land of Africa is destroyed. The beauty of the land was destroyed by the wickedness of fire and iron, which is regarded as modernization or modernity that the so-called colonialists brought to Africa. So the so-called modernization is no more than taking away Africa's resources. So the reference to land is an indication that the injustice to Africa was not at one spot, but all over the continent. It is not only in Angola, where the poet comes from. It is in the entire Africa where a lot of injustice is done, and the whole land of Africa is grieved because the beauty of the land is destroyed. The tradition of the people is also crushed. And now the wickedness of fire and iron, which is modernization or modernity that the people brought, only destroy the integrity and morality and culture of the Africans. It does not bring any kind of succor or the kind of amelioration from suffering of the Africans. So what the poem talks about in stanza 2 is that the beauty of the land is destroyed, and the people brought what they call civilization in the guise of taking away the resources of the Africans. So you could see also, look at another form of modern ancient slavery. So in the modern slavery, they use chain, they drag Africans to Europeans to go and become slaves and be working in sugarcane plantations and be doing some kind of domestic course for them. But in the modern slavery, they give us MasterCard, they give us several money. Like now, so almost all countries in Africa are indebted to China. Many countries in Africa. And they call International Monetary Fund. They give money to different African countries. Then they determine the value of your currency. And also, some of them that give loan are now taking away our resources, exploiting us. So all these kind of borrowing, giving of loan, giving of bond are modern slavery. The ancient slavery, the Africans were taking, some of them died in the Atlantic Ocean while they were being transported from Africa to the European countries. But today, such kind of slavery is not much. And it is still existing in a way that several Africans still want to travel to European countries. When you go to embassies of the European countries in African countries, you will be surprised several Africans want to go there. Why? They want to go and do some kind of unpleasant job. Washing of toilet, washing of plate, washing of dead body, digging of graves, several other inhuman jobs just to get money, because what they have in their own country have been exploited by the so-called Europeans. And now we go to their land to beg for money. And when they borrow us, they continue with the kind of slavery which the poem refers to as modern slavery. So in stanza 3 of the poem captures the grieved land of Africa in the dream soon undone, in jiggling of jailer's key, and in the stiff laughter and victorious voice of lament, and in the unconscious brilliance of hidden sensations of the grieved land of Africa. So another level of persecution of Africa is in the dream. In their dream, because several Africans are being put in prison, and that was why the poem refers to the jailer and the jingling of jailer's bell. So when the Africans in the prison hear the coming of the jailers or the coming of the prison warders, what you will call prison warder in the modern day, when they are coming and the jingling of the keys, which they used to enter into the prison, probably to torture the prisoners or to give them food or one thing or the other. When they hear it, they become very, very disturbed. So the Africans dream of freedom from colonial exploitation and hope for self-rule. So this freedom, which will bring a kind of laughter and victorious voices, is being stifled by the colonizers because they don't want the Africans to get free. So the stifling herald a kind of lament from the Africans. So the poet argues that Africans are dogged and that is hidden from their oppressors. They did not know that Africans are determined to endure any kind of suffering just to get freedom at last. So the poet envisaged the imminent freedom in the last two lines of stanza 3, which he said, and in the conscious brilliance of hidden sensation of the grieved lands of Africa. So the Africans are enduring to get freedom from the colonial rule. So in stanza 4 of the poem, there is a kind of hope and a kind of assuation. So we see that alive in themselves are with us alive. They bubble up in dreams, decked with dances by Boabu, over balances by the antelope in the perpetual alliance of everything that lives. So in spite of all the sufferings of the Africans remain alive. Despite the dehumanization, the Africans are alive. The land is also alive and can sustain themselves without the aid of the colonizers. So the poet argued that the exploitation of Africa did not lead Africans to depression. Rather, Africans are lively and bubbling with dreams, and Africans are hoping for imminent freedom and independence. So Africans dream, they dance, and also hope for better future, where everything will work in alliance to the favor of the Africans. So in stanza 5, the poet continues with the hope, and he says, they shout out in the sound of life. Shout it. Even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic in portrait offering of incoherence and death, and in the clearness of rivers, all this happening do not deter the Africans. So this stanza is a continuation of the argument of the poet from stanza 4, that despite the dehumanization and the ill-treatment of the Africans are still sound in health and are full of life. Even the corpses thrown up by the Atlantic do not discourage the Africans and do not discourage the African consciousness in the Africans. So they are the corpse of the dead people, the dead Africans who were being transported to the Europeans. Some of them died along the way and they were thrown to the Atlantic Ocean. Some of them who proved stubborn tried to resist a kind of slavery and being transported to European countries were thrown into the river. Some of them were eaten by fish. Some of them died, and then the Atlantic Ocean threw their body up. So despite all this, Africans are not disappointed, are not discouraged, and they are still hoping for freedom. So in the next in stanza 6, they live the grieved land of Africa in the harmonious sound of conscience, contained in the honest blood of men, in the strong desire of men, in the sincerity, in the pure and simple rightness of the star's existence. So the poem captures that rather than Africans die, they live. They did not die. They live despite the grieved land of Africa. The land also, despite being grieved, this land also still survived the colonial invasion. There is the will among the Africans to live and survive their years of human denigration. So Africans survive because the stars also survive. The rightness of the stars' existence. And since the stars survive, the Africans hope And that hope gives them a kind of life and liveliness, and they survive the dehumanization and the ill-treatment of the Africans by the colonial oppressors. So the Africans survive this, and the poet capture it that despite the land being grieved, the land is not dead, and the Africans as well did not die. They survived the colonial inhumanity. Oh, in the last stanza, stanza 7, the poem says, they live the grieved land of Africa because we are living and are imperishable particles of the grieved land of Africa. This is like a kind of song of victory or song of hope for victory. The grieved land of Africa are not dying. They live because we are all living. So the poet argued that Africans are imperishable, despite the several attempts by the colonizers to annihilate Africans from their own land and take away their land and use their land to cultivate rubbers, to cultivate other things, and take mineral resources from their land. Africa are still dogged, are still surviving, and are still hoping for freedom, hoping for independence, hoping for self-rule. And at the end of the poem, we realize that the poet is full of hope that the victory and the freedom of Africa is imminent. And when the Africans get their freedom, the land of Africa will stop to be grieving. The land will not be grieving again because the inhuman treatment and the abomination being committed are being perpetrated by the colonizer. So if the colonizers are dislodged and the Africans take full charge of their land and of their self-rule, then the land will not be grieving again. The land survive, the Africans survive. So in this poem now, you can see a lot of themes. I have discussed some of these things before in my previous lesson. Please, you can search the channel. You will get the video of the major themes in the Grieved Land of Africa by Augostinho Neto. And I'm still going to be discussing more themes in the novel. So, sorry, more themes in the poem. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you get notified when the video is uploaded. So I have this assignment for you. Do it personally, and you can post your answer in the comment section. I'm going to look at it, and then I'm going to evaluate your response to the question. You can give a detailed stanza by stanza account of the poem, The Grieved Land of Africa. How does the poem portray the circumstances of the African before and now? Attempt a justification of the title of the poem in relation to its content. Make sure you respond to this assignment so that you will get more knowledge. So thank you. Have a great day. Remember to subscribe.